All right. Hi, everybody. We'll get started. Um, Welcome to our lecture for the lecture series. We have two more coming up. Next Monday, we'll have Belmont Fremont. That would be Belmont Freeman. That will be in CAS 106 at 3:30. And then we'll end the series on November 27th at 3:30 here in J100 with Lara del Pino. But before we get to those two, I'd like to introduce our lecturer for today, Sarah Ruel-Bergeron. She is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Healthy Housing at the International Society for Urban Health, and has recently joined us as a faculty member here at the School of Public Architecture. She's a licensed architect and global health expert who has won awards and international recognition for her previous work for Archive Global, implementing housing interventions that improve health outcomes in at-risk communities around the world. She has participated in expert group meetings with the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, and UN Habitat, and presented at numerous conferences about topics of healthy housing, implementation, research, and advocacy. She has substantial proficiency working in multiple languages, English, Spanish, and French, as well as across disciplines, both in partnerships and within her teams. Her backgrounds include extensive experience in project ideation, grant writing, and project management, as well as affordable housing, healthcare, architecture, and construction, with a focus on sustainable design, resiliency, hazard mitigation, and in vulnerable environments. With that, I want to welcome Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us today for the lecture.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. So, yes, your water. So with that, I will not do more of an introduction. We're just gonna hop right in. Let's see how far we can get. So as architects, our professional duty is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the general population, HSW. But a 2022 NCARB survey of thousands of architects shows that the understanding of how an architect achieves this is mostly by minding fire safety, structural stability, accessibility, indoor air quality, and a sense of safety and security. And I'm here to kind of talk to us about how that's actually quite a limited view, and we really want to be expanding our thinking, particularly out of School of Public Architecture. So the idea of healthy housing, I mean, I think it well predates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but in 1948, the Declaration of Human Rights put out an Article 24.5.1 specifically addresses the relationship between health and housing. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. And it goes on, but I think this is a really important tie, that we're recognizing that these two are really intricately linked and need to be considered together at all times. So even though we have the Declaration of Human Rights as making this association for us, there's 8 billion people in the world, and 3.6 billion people live without adequate sanitation services. 2 billion people live without access to clean and safe drinking water. 1.6 billion people lack adequate housing. 1.1 billion people live in informal settlements or slums, and 1 billion people live on dirt floors. So you can see out of that 8 billion, these are really high proportions. And a lot of times you have people living within these kind of same conditions. So somebody who's going to live without adequate sanitation facilities may also be living with dirt floors. And these conditions compound some of the health impacts that we're going to talk about today. And I think it's important to say that, you know, I show some of those conditions and we say, yeah, I don't know anybody who lives on dirt floors. Like, we think of this as a problem that's kind of going on somewhere else. But actually, this is a map of New York City, and this is looking at disparities within the city based on your zip code, how long you are expected to live. So this is very specifically mapping, you know, the built environment to health outcomes and saying they're actually really unfair. We have, you know, some of the lower income neighborhoods are the ones where you're seeing the lowest, you know, rates. So I'm 65 years old. I mean, I live in Brooklyn, so you have in East, you know, Flatbush and Brownsville. That's where we're seeing those, you know, I guess you'd say the lowest rates of, you know, your life expectancy is extremely low. So this is shocking, but it really helps to tie the point together. And so I want us to think about that as we move forward. This is not a problem out there. Inadequate housing is a problem everywhere. Now, going back a little bit about my personal history, because I think that helps to ground why this matters so much to me. So I have grown up mostly abroad. My parents work in my parents work mostly in poverty alleviation work, and my mom works as a nutritionist. My father as in food security. And so when I was growing up in Guatemala, they were going out to these kind of conditions regularly, and they were surveying and they were doing projects, implementation projects in these particular types of contexts. And I remember from a very young age, well, first of all, I like always wanted to be an architect since I was 6, so here I am. But also, it became really clear to me, I didn't understand how we were going to be talking about nutrition and things that felt really secondary when we had really poor housing conditions. And so it became very ingrained in my mind that health and housing really need to go together, that our efforts at combating health problems really need to start in housing. And I'll kind of come back to that theme over and over again. And it's a little too small for me to read it off of there, so let me read it for you guys. So there's a few different, as I mentioned, there's a few different parts of housing that kind of compound health problems, but here we're just going to look at a few different ones because I think people say, well, what's the big deal? What's the problem with inadequate housing? And I think it's a little more obvious here, but you'll see that we're going to look at conditions that are, in our backyard. So household materials can be really problematic. They can host insects that cause diseases like chagas and scrub typhus, but I'll also, at some point talk about how we also layer materials for assembly. And I think here we're really showing extreme conditions to illustrate the point, but there's a lot of subtlety within the material choices that we make and the health impacts that they have for people. Food stored in unhygienic environments can host life-threatening bacteria, mold, and lead to rodent-borne illnesses. So vermin infestations are really problematic in these areas. If you have lots of vermin around, you can have asthma. These conditions are particularly bad for small children who are really low to the ground and who are kind of experiencing the world at a very different scale than it's kind of built for. Inadequate access to water and sanitation. I mentioned 3.6 billion people are living without adequate access to sanitation. They're a common source for diarrheal disease, hepatitis, and many neglected tropical diseases. And just to pause on the question of diarrheal disease, like what's the big deal? Well, diarrheal disease will cause anemia, will cause, cognitive development problems in small children. So there's ripple effects and secondary impacts to the primary, health implications of the housing conditions. Dirt floors carry parasites, bacteria, and viruses that cause diarrhea, hepatitis, typhoid fever, and neglected tropical diseases. So these are all obviously pretty problematic conditions. We can look at another household typology. So you have windows, doors, and eaves. Those are entry points for insects, rodents, and animals, exposing families to vector-borne diseases, rodent-borne illnesses, and more. And I'll talk a bit more about vector-borne diseases. Those are diseases that are transmitted by a vector, so that's some sort of insect. It can be a mosquito, a tick, a sandfly. There's a few different versions or a few different insects associated to vector-borne diseases, but these are really problematic. Malaria, for example, is an enormous killer of small children, particularly in the global south. But with climate change and temperatures changing, we are starting to see migration of some diseases, and these diseases will come back to this particular context. And the front line to kind of combat this will be the built environment. Debris around the home provides a breeding ground for malaria-carrying mosquitoes and a hiding place for deadly snakes. In particularly like rural conditions where this household is from, if you get bit by a snake, that might be the end. Like you can't necessarily get to proper care in a good enough amount of time to save your life. So snake bites are actually really problematic, and they're considered one of these like neglected tropical diseases because there's just not much attention being paid to it, but it's really problematic. Overcrowding exacerbates the spread of infectious disease and increases diseases spread through proximity to livestock and other animals. And so yes, when we talk about overcrowding, we're not just talking about overcrowding between humans, we're talking about overcrowding with chickens and goats and everybody else we're living with. And so this will be a more familiar context, right? So here, what do we see? We see some of the conditions that we were talking about before. Overcrowding is still a problem in these particular conditions. Vermin infestations, still a problem in these particular conditions. But we also have some of the, the things that we think of more commonly. So we'll have asbestos, which is found in many building materials, and eradicating it, or getting rid of all of it is costly, it's time intensive, it's difficult. And it can cause cancers such as mesothelioma. But there's a number of diseases associated to that. Inadequate community resources. So we're going to start talking about not only the household scale, but importantly, how the household scale connects out to its community becomes really important, because the line between you know, your house, your peri-domestic environment, your community environment, and your city all blend together, particularly when we're looking at health outcomes. So if you have inadequate community resources like lack of access to markets and green spaces, these increase the levels of stress, anxiety, social isolation, and reduce mental health. And we obviously have Stephanie, who's particularly interested in food access. And so this also, you know, food deserts are problematic to nutrition. These are all related to the built environment. Lead can be found in homes, paints, pipes, paints, or household objects that are built before 1978. And they can cause anemia, kidney and brain damage, and cognitive impairment in children. So you can see these lists are pretty extensive. Radon is a colorless and odorless gas that's found mostly in the ground, but it can seep up into the building. And because it's odorless and colorless, you don't know, and it causes physical disabilities and various cancers. So then I just wanted to give you an idea. So this is what the World Health Organization sees as for housing. So there's a lot of the things that I've already named. Healthy housing currently sits in a weird place within WHO. In 2018, they put out guidelines that were really critical in putting healthy housing on the map from WHO's perspective. I think it's a very good first start, but that effort has significantly stalled. Not only in the implementation of those guidelines in different regions, but also in the fact that when WHO puts out guidelines, they have very specific systematic reviews and methodologies for what can make it into normative documents and what cannot. And so there's so much that is left out because we don't have enough research to establish the associations between some of these conditions and, you know, and health implications. So I mentioned the Housing and Health Guidelines came out in 2018. Again, that was WHO's effort to address healthy housing to a certain extent. And Archive, I participated in an implementation workshop for us to talk about how do we take these guidelines, which are really imperfect because they can't give you any information about a specific threshold. So when they talk about high or low indoor air temperatures, they can't give you a threshold because this is culturally specific. It's dependent on your conditions. And so that makes it really difficult to enforce anything or to implement something into policy. And so part of what we acknowledged in that meeting is that we really needed to have informal vehicles for these conversations around healthy housing. Even just to start, how do you define healthy housing? That's something that is actually not, not within WHO's, glossary, and it's not something that we all have an agreement upon. And so even defining that term is difficult. And so we developed the Health Through Housing Coalition at Archive, and now we've brought it over to ISUH, and we have a managing board which includes WHO, UN Habitat, and a lot of other academics who are working in this space, so that we can start to make these, these connections, these links, share resources. We just, we're a multidisciplinary group of people who have the same end goal, right? And that's just to improve housing everywhere, because it exists everywhere in every single city. And so we've developed this, and it has resources, it has a member forum. We lack the resources to really activate it as fully as it can. But we think that it's, it's a really good step forward in terms of advancing the conversation beyond WHO. And we continue in conversation with WHO to try to figure out other mechanisms or other vehicles for us to be able to do this. But it's really difficult without funding. I mean, the continuous conversation around funding, right? And so, so part of what, oh my God, sorry, I went so far. Okay. So what we did at Archive in an attempt to, maybe I should say, like, scratch the itch of like, okay, so what, I showed you guys some photos and we started associating, okay, there's certain housing conditions that are associated to certain diseases. Okay, like, what does that mean? But we really center our work in an evidence-based way, and we want to do implementation in an evidence-based way. And at some point we felt like we just didn't quite have enough information. And so we started mapping the literature, all of the literature that exists around housing and health. And we mapped it all in the English language with no timeline. And so here you see kind of a compacted version of it. what was it? And you have in the column, sorry, in the column you have the WHO classification for diseases. That's pretty easy. You know, they're going to tell us how do they classify diseases. There's communicable diseases, things that can be transmitted from one human to another. Non-communicable diseases, which also includes like mental health, life-altering conditions, these kind of things. What you see at the top, you have the related home environment factors and then related community factors. Because I keep saying that they're pretty closely tied, and so sometimes it's a little gray where that defining line is. And then we have like a whole TBD section because it's really, you know, a one-off paper that's mapping household locations. So like proximity to brackish water, proximity to the woods, proximity to the jungle, and they're not actually overlapping in terms of information. So this goes on forever. But that was also one of the conditions that we wanted to map. What I wanted to come back on is, again, this complexity of trying to figure out how to map healthy housing and how to figure this out, because the household design and structure is complex. Like if you design it poorly, you may not have air ventilation, and then if you design it properly, you might. But then if you assemble certain materials together, you might have mold, and so then you're still causing problems. Like the problems really overlap, and it's very difficult to compartmentalize them into very clear categories. And we really did a literature to try to figure out how do we understand the different methods for compartmentalizing different types of built environment risks to health. And I'm here to tell you, I don't have an answer yet, because what this looks like actually is this. So it's a really large, complex map. Part of the interest of doing it in a table format was for it to tell us what the gaps are. So where is there not enough evidence for us to act upon it? Can we go collect that data? You know, what else can we do about it? So this has been an exercise we've been doing at Archive, trying to find funding for it, because it's just a massive body of work. But then if we just look at like one small subsection of this, if we're looking at airborne diseases and what is it? Sorry, it's small on that screen. It's airborne, yeah. So airborne diseases across different housing factors. What we were trying to map here is to say, okay, if it's a dark red or if it's a number 3, there's a strong association. So that means that like CDC is talking about it, WHO is talking about it, there's more than 3 peer-reviewed journal papers who are talking about this association. It's probably pretty clear. And then you have 2s, which are kind of in the middle, and then 1, which is that relationship is somewhat established, but it's really not well proven. And so that may be also a place where you might want to dig further. And going back to the Health Housing Coalition, okay. What becomes really clear also is that we just don't speak the same language as public health and global health professionals. And this becomes really problematic when we try to do multidisciplinary work. I mean, there's a reason that our work is really siloed, is because we speak the same language together, right? And so if I start talking to you guys about vector-borne diseases, about tuberculosis, about, you know, I'll talk about randomized controlled trials, it's just going to fly over your head. And so we really want to be finding a way to have these conversations in a way that everybody is brought up to speed and everybody is speaking at the same level about the same thing. So from this table that we had created, we then have a glossary of terms, and that's going to tell us, okay, what is tuberculosis? What are the secondary impacts? Because if you remember, I mentioned the ripple effects or the secondary impacts to tuberculosis are really significant and important to consider. And it might tell you something about how to prioritize an intervention that's going to work on tuberculosis versus an intervention that's going to treat something that has less secondary impact or that has less of an impact throughout the world or is less endemic in a certain area. And then same for public health and global health professionals. Like I'm here speaking to, you know, a design audience, obviously, but from from the global health perspective, I know ventilation is somewhat of a simple example, but they may not understand what we're talking about when we're talking about how to use the built environment to solve some of these problems. And that's one of the feedback that's some of the feedback that I have gotten on the very, you know, large table that we've created is people want solutions. You know, from the global health side, they're asking for solutions because they don't actually have much access to architects and designers because this is not the typical work that we do. And so I'm here to tell us that is the typical work we're going to do, but it's a little further down the line. So Stephanie mentioned that I am now at the International Society for Urban Health. However, most of my healthy housing work was done as the executive director of Archive Global. It was started in 2006 and ended in 2023. But I mean, by ended in 2023, I just mean we merged with the International Society for Urban Health. So the portfolio of our work came with it. I came with it. So there's still healthy housing there. There's an implementation arm in healthy housing, and some of my team has come over as well. But in that span of time, we worked in 12 different countries. We improved almost 3,000 structures, and those 3,000 structures house about 14,000 people. And then we also do a large advocacy campaign, which I'll talk about through the example of a project, to about 5 million people. And I'm about to launch another campaign around the Bangladesh project, which will increase the last numbers. But the premise of the work that we were doing is really focused on research, design, and advocacy. And so I want to talk about each of those separately, but through the vehicle of a project, because I think that really helps to ground exactly what we're doing, what I'm talking about, and kind of put some of these concepts together, because I'm kind of toggling between some of the conceptual frameworks through which we have done our work, and then I want to talk about the implementation of what we have actually done. What does that look like on the ground, and how are we helping actual communities and families? So our Bangladesh project, we have nicknamed it Munta Mortar. It started in 2013 and is ongoing. I was informed today that we have more funding to do more of the work, so we continue that project. The original hypothesis we arrived in Bangladesh was if we can eradicate dirt floors, we can drastically reduce diarrheal disease. That was an evidence-based hypothesis, and it just wasn't done in this particular context, but we know that diarrheal disease is endemic in this context. Bangladesh is a riverine country. It has about 800 rivers flowing through a very small country. With climate change, the monsoon season is coming, the rains are coming earlier, they're staying longer, and there's a lot more flooding. And so getting, a really solid base to the homes is actually a really critical piece. So these are the kind of the existing conditions here. So this is what a typical house looks like. It is a corrugated metal panel enclosure around the house. That is not a particularly good material to live in, but it's just the existing conditions that we find. And we have been very specific about only tackling one single aspect of the household in order to be able to make this association I'm talking about between the component of the built environment that you're changing and the health outcome that you're seeing. If I was building a completely new home, I couldn't say, well, look, the floor was what helped with diarrheal disease. You would say, well, maybe it was that you changed the walls. Maybe it was that you now made a new road or whatever, So we really want to try to isolate what we're doing in order to be able to make a case for why we're doing it. And then on the right, this is actually quite an old assembly that we used, and we have drastically improved on it. But the reason, I think this is interesting, the reason we're using brick and then concrete on top, so not a very good tensile structure at all. And this was just their local methodology for construction. It created a very cheap floor, which to a certain extent is helpful. It's a much bigger, it's a great improvement on dirt floors. And dirt floors, the problem is they're just really hard to clean. I mean, realistically, people spend hours maintaining and cleaning dirt floors and compacting it, and still you have, really rampant disease. And so the idea is that the concrete floor is just much more cleanable and much more efficient. And so what we ended up doing was working with the Housing and Building Research Institute in Bangladesh. We also worked with Grimshaw, but to help us create a very locally produced assembly that was, that is the strongest, is the most long-lasting, but is also the most cost-effective. In Bangladesh, there are so many illegal brick plants because it's a really quick, cheap way to make some money that the government has prohibited the use of bricks. And so, so this is an illegal concern. No, we're not doing this anymore. But this is kind of where it started, and just helps to see that we work with the existing conditions. We really just, we excavate out the perimeter of the floor. The families have to move out, and then we bring them back in a couple of weeks after we've done the construction. We work with local masons. In the latest phase of the Bangladesh project, we trained women in masonry construction, local women in masonry construction, and then employ them through the project to see if that is a gender non-conforming role and job that they can do in the future. And so we haven't collected that data yet, so TBD. I think we will find out in just about a month how successful that is, and then the new funding will allow us to continue training those women on more of these floors. And then education advocacy cannot be like left aside. So this is not something we're used to. I think there's two things to point out here. Like in architecture, we're not used to training people how to use our buildings, right? But this is something that when you're looking at health promoting practices, behavioral change is really critical in seeing the necessary change. And so we always do an advocacy campaign. We do it for the participants who are going to live within the household. We do it for community members who are inhabiting that neighborhood and who might benefit from learning what are the correct times for hand washing, and learning about, food preparation and things that will help keep them healthy. And the community and participant teachings are always related to the particular problem we're solving. So we're not going to teach them about, vector-borne diseases when we're there to talk about diarrheal disease. But we're going to teach them about a lot of related things to that. So it's not just not a single focus. And what we love about our local partner, again, we always work with a local partner, but our local partner in Bangladesh is particularly good because they really work on recall. So they ask people to remember the information, so that the trainings are extremely interactive. And you can see here there's lots of women raising their hands who are being asked, questions. And then we also know when they do hand washing trainings, for example, they'll have everybody in a line. They'll put turmeric on the hands of the first person, and they'll shake hands with the next person, and the next person, and the next person. And they don't forget those messages because they learn them in a really interactive, experiential way. And so our local partner is just really, really good at that. And so I think it's really important, I've put capacity building here, but I actually don't believe so much in capacity building. I believe in knowledge exchange, because we learn as much from the community and our local partners as they do from us. There might be some components of capacity building that we need to do, but we are always taking in a lot of information. So it's really important that we're not helicoptering in and saving everybody. That's not our role. Our role is really to hear the voice from the community, solve problems, and also be a liaison to, financial resources and those kind of things. So on that point, we also really make sure that we speak about our work at conferences, and we exhibit the work, and we publish the work. We find ways to get this out there, partially because if you go back to that chart that I was showing you, if the evidence isn't put out there, it's not feeding into this larger body of evidence about how important adequate housing is. And although it's a really innate thing, for us to think about, yes, of course, we want nicer housing because we want to be healthy, I think we lack making that connection, and I think it's really not focused on in architecture school, which is part of the reason I'm here, because I really want us to spend time flexing that muscle continuously, so that everything we do is always going to think about, is that the best for the people that I'm working with, the communities that we're working with. But we'll touch on that a little bit more. So what's the big deal? What came out of it? We have done 368 floors. We have redone 368 floors, particularly in Bangladesh. So I talked about, I don't know how many thousand structures, but this is just for the Bangladesh project. And I think we just got funding for 20 more or so. The price of the square foot is 75 cents, where it was, really inexpensive, but actually the families were not happy with that. They felt like it was really kind of cheap. I'm not sure what their determining factor was for that, but now we've gotten to a happy middle ground of $1.21 per square foot is a really strong, proven methodology for that assembly. We see a 77% decrease in diarrheal disease. So do we make an impact on diarrheal disease? Yes. But we also have unintended consequences. That's not always a negative thing. So we also happen to make an impact on breathing problems, 83% decrease on breathing problems. And that is because during the dry season. What we weren't considering is that during the dry season, when it's really dry, you're kicking up that dust, and so you're breathing it in, and the children are breathing it in. And so diarrheal disease is really a problem of the rainy season, and then respiratory problems are a problem of the dry season. And so we're able to have an impact on both with this. We're seeing a decrease in vermin infestations, medical bills, and everyday stress. And I can't stress enough the importance of the everyday stress, because what we're seeing is, women are spending all of their time at home. They're spending about 20 hours a week maintaining those dirt floors, and they're getting a lot of that time back because now they can use really common methods of, these are not large floors, so they can clean them quite easily. So we get qualitative data back that says I can eat lunch, I can eat lunch now, or I can take my kids to school now. So you're really seeing that it's improving the lives of these families very fundamentally. We're seeing an increase in household value from 22 to 46%, depending on who you're talking to, but that provides better access to credit. I mean, it's really critical that the household value improves. And then you have an increase in security, social status, days at work, days at school. And so, I think the social status point cannot be undermined, because what I've come to realize through the kind of life of the Bangladesh project is the way to sell it to the community is through the social status upgrade, because that's really what they're after for kind of like immediate issues. And and then that kind of like the high of having a new floor, of feeling much more established, having something that they've never been able to have. These are people who have always lived on dirt floors, and so that will kind of they'll do their hand washing, you really see better health outcomes. But through time, once some of these behavioral practices maybe start to decline, they say, oh yeah, you're right, I really did see that our family is less sick, that we're spending less on medical bills, that my husband can go to work more days a week, that my kids are not missing school so much, and so they're the proof is in the pudding, essentially. Like, they're seeing that this that their lives are improving, and then they're selling that to the community members. And so we actually, when we tour the community, you have people who are like imitating our project, which I think is like the best sign of like this is a successful project, because we have a very our projects look very specific. I think you saw it. There's a red base, and then the actual floor is black, and these were the original floors were just concrete, and the community members said, like, no, we want them beautiful, and this is what they're going to look like. And so they branded them for themselves, and now we have people imitating the project. And so these are the families that we impact. This is the reason that I do my work, is for the amazing families that we meet along the way. Some of them have their floors in the background. Actually, most of them do have their floors in the background. And they're just, really happy, joyful, thankful people, and just amazing to be around. So that is the Bangladesh project. Let me fly west to Ivory Coast. Does anybody have any questions on the Bangladesh project? Maybe we can like pause. I'm going really fast. Yeah. Definitely.
So first of all, I really appreciate that, like, we do so much, especially at the and I understand why after we work just not for the root of the changes in them. Do you have intentions of trying to explore also like the other things that you covered, where like once you've done a good job of sort of giving those people the tools to really make healthy floors, do you ventilation?
And it's a really good question. So, we can get into this. It's like the unsexy part of the conversation is funding, right? I mean, it's difficult. And what we're doing ends up being a little bit bulky, because we have to do a research study, we have to do the implementation of a built environment project, and then we do the advocacy. The large bulk of our cost is on the construction, like materials and labor. We have, and we're at the mercy of what we can find in terms of funding. And so yes, absolutely. When we originally proposed the Bangladesh project, we had also asked for funding to redo like latrines and water sources. And right now we had an opportunity to look at that again. I mean, it's just a triangulation between factors. And so sometimes, so it just depends what you're kind of after. But yes, those our local partner, for example, has said with some families in the Bangladesh project, like they're really, really poor. Some of their corrugated metal has been totally eaten away by the environment. Can we replace some of their, we have a little spare cash. Can we replace, like, there's a little extra in the project. Can we replace panels? And like, yes, of course. But there is there's a difficulty in, intervening with these kind of like really strategic points. And so like ventilation is like the least of my worries, and they're like living in ovens, and so like, yes, it's a ventilation problem, but I think the materials with which they're building their households are totally inadequate. And interestingly, in this kind of like I consider this to be like a safe space for us to talk about things. Interestingly, our local partner had said, well, we've had so much success with our flooring project that now the government is giving us money to do more houses, which is wonderful. And he shows me pictures, and they're more corrugated metal houses, and so I'm like, oh, like, why do you build new and you build it the same way? But it's what people are also used to seeing. They feel safe in these homes, and so it's a complicated dynamic. We would have to look at, when we decide to enter a new place for a different reason, or come back to a place for a different reason, we're going to look at what's endemic in that area. And so, what's endemic, where the funding is, and what the built environment intervention is that we think we can solve. Those are going to be the factors that we triangulate to define where we build something new. And so, yeah, it's just kind of complicated. Any other questions? Yeah, right?
Yeah, so my questions are so you were using, you were talking about the locals using the same idea.
Oh, like, yeah, imitating the project.
Yes, and my question is obviously the goal is to help them, so your company is for helping them. But how do you go about allowing them to have that, to have that space and develop that space while you're still working?
Is your question, I just want to make sure I understand your question. Is your question, how do we not just like helicopter and then get out, and like what happens to the community once we leave?
More like, do you think it would be better to try to establish them as you are leaving rather than just the in and out process? Like, do more for, you already done a great job with the architectural side. How about establishing them on that business side as well?
So how can we do more like cohesive, like socioeconomic development within the community? So there's a few ways that we do that within the parameters of what we can do. I mean, Archive was, and now ISUH is also really small nonprofit organization. So we don't establish, we don't have like country offices in certain places. So we always work through a local implementing partner. The process of working through that local implementing partner does capacity building for them. So as I said, they can access other funding, and they're community based. I mean, they walk down the street, they know absolutely everybody. So they're bringing, this like increases their capacity to bring resources into that community. So I think that piece of it is valuable. And then the local masons, for example, I have seen the same masons every time I go. So on like most of the phases, it's the same guys, and then they are being, talked to to not have a better term for it, about empowering women through teaching them masonry construction and teaching them, these kind of gender non-conforming rules. I mean, it's really alternative to be teaching women masonry construction, but that's one of these additional ways that we're trying to help the community from, a more sort of like grassroots level of like helping them help themselves rather than like constantly a hand out, We also have the local implementing partner facilitates, the dialogue around, so we create a selection criteria for the families who are going to make it into the project and those who aren't. And sometimes people drop out. And so what we've had is that the community themselves vote on who else should get the floor then, at that stage. And so there's really like a cohesive environment in terms of helping each other out. I think there's not a, like what I find really nice about the Shavar community where we've been working is that they're really, helping each other. They understand that people are in really dire conditions. And so they kind of help those that are at the bottom first, So we see that kind of happening as an organic process. So I think, does that answer your question somewhat? Yeah, we can talk about it more, right, if you want, separately. Um, any other questions before I move on to Ivory Coast? Holy, okay. Let's skip through Ivory Coast. What's interesting about the Ivory Coast project is it is a randomized controlled trial. It is a dengue prevention project, and the intent here is to decrease decrease dengue through citizen action. And so this is again really, heavily focused on community participatory efforts, but also through a very multidisciplinary team of entomologists, sociologists, people specialized in WASH. I'm the only built environment person. We're really trying to collaborate across disciplines and then empower people within this community to think beyond their front door and take action within the public space and public sphere to improve their community. So this is a community participatory workshops with some of our team intermingled in it. I will not get into how dengue is transmitted, but hopefully we'll give you access to this presentation and you can have a look for yourself, even though it's in French. I'm happy to talk about it in a deeper dive. These are the conditions that we're working in. And then I just wanted to touch on, like what I'll try to end on, is the work that we're now doing with the International Society for Urban Health. And so this merging that we've done with ISUH really was intended to allow us to work at more building scales. So we're spanning from healthy housing, the peri-domestic environment, the community environment, the city environment, urban scale. We have different partners, and so that's kind of helping us, but also they're much more of an academic, they were much more of, into academia, policy research, and close connections with WHO, and we were really more the implementation side. And so now we're really trying to kind of merge all of this and do all of this within one single umbrella. And the reason that this matters, this will be the kind of last maybe like learning that I'll leave with you guys, that genes account for 10% of human disease, and the other 90% of our risk is determined by our environment. So think back to the slide where we looked at like this pockmark of the New York City. This is a kind of conceptual model of how that's done. And so what I come back to continuously is those first two circles are really the home space. That is where we make decisions about health. It's dependent on our culture, on our religion, on our economic status, on your socioeconomic status, the friends you have, what they're doing. Choices around the way you live your life are very, very, very cultural and very social. And then that kind of bleeds out to kind of goes in and out of the community space, which is, social services, infrastructure, green space, transit, air pollution. And so there's a relationship between those two scales. And then I think of climate change as really this cross-cutting aspect that is going from the home scale, because obviously we know we can be heavily impacted by climate change at home. It can really impact our community, and it can go beyond. And all of these are really looking, I think we're looking through the lens of health equity. So, how are we improving health from all of these different scales to improve equity? And this might be a little bit difficult to see, but this is a diagram that I created for a book chapter that will hopefully come out soon, but it is like a riff on a CDC diagram, which has climate change at the center with some of the factors that happen on the outside of it. Then there's the climate impact. So, rising temperatures, more extreme weather, rising sea levels, and increasing CO2 levels will cause, changes in vector ecology. Well, changes in vector ecology then will cause malaria, dengue, encephalitis, or I'm going out to the last health risk slide. And that's what the CDC was showing, is just, the climate impact, and then the next ring was a health impact. And what I think is really important is to bump that out and to say, actually, the built environment is the interstitial space between the climate impact and the health outcomes. And we really need to be operating within that space and like make an impact there, because I think we can see that really clearly from the inside, that we have the capacity to prevent disease through our actions. And if we don't, then we're not, there's no neutral anymore. Like climate change is too present for us to say, well, I'm not dealing with climate change and I'm not dealing with health just by not interacting or like not flexing our muscles about thinking about how we deal with health and how we deal with climate change. I think that's putting us in really bad territory. So I just want to us to think about and constantly flex this muscle around how can we be improving health, how can we use the built environment to make really powerful change. I think we just need to see ourselves as public health actors and part of that conversation to do the best that we can. And I think there's, so I guess I won't talk about the Accelerating City Equity Project, right? Because we're out of time. 5 minutes, okay, good. I blasted through so that we could get here. So we have the Accelerating City Equity Project. So that is an ISUH project that I have participated on both as from Archive Global's perspective in year 1 and then now as part of ISUH in year 2. So this project was a really interesting project in that, you know, and not my typical kind of project because at Archive I'm doing more implementation and I'm known for that implementation piece of what we do. And what ACE was doing is saying, yes, we know you guys are all doing amazing work in sustainable urban development, sustainable and equitable urban development. Let's collect these bright spots. And so there were 5 different regional hubs that were created on all continents, and bright spots were collected. And we've spoken to, I don't know, many organizations. We have about 150 bright spots that are being collected of amazing projects abroad that are improving equity and improving health in these communities in lots of places. And so the first one is Makila Housing Trust there in India. They're painting roofs white, and I'll let you guys read more about that because we're kind of out of time. The Asian Coalition for Housing Rights in Nepal it's in Nepal and Indonesia and like 17 other countries in Asia. What's amazing about the Asia Coalition for Housing Rights, which I'd like us to figure out their methods for the Trenton Project, is they empower communities to track their own data, to collect their own data, and then push that out for policy change and for change within their community. So it's really a grassroots level, but they are having productive change. And then here on the right is a biodigesting project in Rio. There's this, an informal settlement that was within this like beautiful protected forested area, and they were trying to find out because they were found out because they were dumping their waste into the city and contaminating this ecosystem. And so they worked with the government to create a biodigester and like use the fuel to make an oven, and now their community is like really thriving because they figured out a way to work together with government for their needs. And so these are the kind of collection of projects that we've been gathering, and the point has been to analyze the way in which they're successfully addressing questions of equity. And so the essence of that project or that synthesis is to now say, what are 5 different practices that we can teach others, that we can teach local government, mayors, city agencies, to drive equity better. And so these are the 5. I won't go into all of them, but we're going to test this material next week in Atlanta with a mayor's roundtable and with other city governments. So I can let you guys know how that goes. But that is the ACE project, and I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I went so fast. There's so much material. So what questions do you guys have? And I mean, you guys see me around, so it won't be difficult to catch me for questions later, but yeah. So how can the government be influenced around all the projects that we've done? So, I think the way that there's a few different things I can say about that, but I think what we're, the bottom line is that, the governments need to spend money. They're supposed to spend it for their community. And I've been speaking to a woman in Argentina who is using this decolonized approach to essentially help align the priorities of the government and the priorities of the community, so that if you can get them into alignment, it's a long process and it's a process of listening to each other and really having a lot of conversations. But once you can get that alignment in place, you're not deciding about, well, what does the mayor want to do versus what does the community need, because your needs are super aligned. In the meantime, until we get to that at like a large scale, I think data is really important. I mean, I'll continue to come back to the fact that we really need the data, and we need the data for these informal communities, for these communities that are left out, because we often don't have data that's like disaggregated enough or that's kind of separated enough for us to be able to make a case for that specific community. Because a lot of times this is one of the big problems. I didn't get into informal settlements and slums, but the point is that they're relatively unaccounted for because if the government really pays attention to them, then they have to figure out what to do with them. And so they're relatively ignored. But that process of ignoring them is ignoring from every standpoint. So when you have a census, when you have health, data collection, you're not capturing that group. So if that's what the government is going to act on, is the data that they have. And a lot of times that data is missing. So that's why, I think this Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, that's and we've seen it in favelas in Brazil. Like, you see that example of people collecting their own data to go to a government and say, these are the conditions on the ground. What can we do to work this out? And then I think that's a really productive way to start to find, collective overlap about how to spend the resources that governments have. Anybody else? Do you have a question? Vanessa has a question. Mm-hmm. Well, I just don't think we can do it all ourselves, right? I mean, I don't think there's any expectation that we will. I think we need to realize we work in teams, and we may be the ones asking the question, like, how are we going to help change behavior in this community if we have some negative behaviors? But also there's a lack of like social services that might support them. I mean, I think we really need to be working more cohesively in an ecosystem of people who are working on healthier housing from multiple scales. There's also a question of like healthy materials. I think healthy materials is a really big equity issue. The cheaper materials, the ones that off-gas the more, are going to be used in affordable housing. You're like, yeah, but then they're getting sick. They don't have access to health care, and therefore you're creating some of the same poor, you're creating other poor health outcomes. I think one of the really important points that I didn't get to talk to about here is the question of post-occupancy evaluation. So we know that as like a term, what I was talking about is just like coming back and surveying a year after, 6 months after, whatever like funding will allow, right? But coming back and saying, did that work for you? Like, no, why not? And to accept that we might like fail at our design, or accept that like there might be other phases, accept that we are evolving professionals that need to learn through our successes, but also through our mistakes. I mean, going back is not only to find out what we did wrong, you'll find out the change that you have made, which I think is a really important feedback for designers. And so I think we need to get really much better, whether we need to do that through through public health for now, because they have mechanisms and methodologies to do that. But we really need a feedback loop. We need to understand what we're doing, because I think we're designing in a vacuum, and we like cut the rope on a building and we get out. Like, what? I mean, how is that possibly a good way of designing when you don't know? We're so good at the paper space and being in the computer, and we don't know what we're creating. So I think that's an important part. And then the behavioral change. I mean, I think this needs to be a collaborative effort. Needs to be worked on with people who are specialists. I really hope that what comes out of this presentation is not like, look at all the things we need to do. It's more, look at all the things we should collaborate with others for healthier, more successful projects. Yeah.
So, we're creating some architecture. This is because the language is very different.
Yeah.
Maybe it was used to it. Thinking about your own education, what would you have liked to be seeing in it, knowing what you know now? What wasn't?
Yeah, I mean, what's not fair, I think, is like I did a certificate in global health practice at Johns Hopkins for 2 years. So like I went back to school to be able to speak this language because I wasn't sure how to get beyond what I was doing. I think we don't all need to do that. I think that if we can, I really firmly believe, and I know a lot of other faculty here really strongly believe in this too, is these multi-sectoral collaborations. Breaking down the silos and speaking with other people will help educate us, in like what the gaps are in our knowledge, what the gaps are in our language, how we can do our work better, and really like part of what, I think I finally, like many years in, am getting better at is saying, okay, what are all these other disciplines we want to work with, and how do we slot in all the different activities that need to happen so that like we don't end up, we just talked about this on the Trenton project, so that we don't end up later without a IRB, an ethical review of the work that we anticipate to do, because we know that we're actually probably going to need that. And so again, I think it's really about listening. It's not a question of saying we need to know it all. It's getting all the right people at the table from the get-go and listening. We don't have budgets for that in typical practice. So I think there's really big gaps here in terms of what we can do, because practice needs to change fundamentally. Which is part of why I wanted to come here and teach you all to do practice better, but because I do think it's a really important point. I think of architects as like conveners and very good problem solvers. And that's what we should be flexing continuously and gathering the people so that we can have all the inputs to make those, to make creative decisions, propose creative solutions, knowing that, I do really take like a problem with these big egos of like, well, this is how we do architecture. Like, no, there's always like a whole team behind you. Everybody's always working with so many other people, and that's what we need to just continuously be reminded of, that everything is a team effort, and we need to be like participating across design disciplines, across public health. And I can't tell you how much I would love to have an economist on my team. I need one, and I just don't have. They're very expensive. So I have, and like people who can do mapping, and like I have a long list of people I want to talk to because I need to learn. Like I'm never done learning. So we're not at a stopping point. We're like at a beginning point. Anyway. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy. I'm sorry I do end up speaking all this like public. I try to keep it relatively, tame in terms.